Today I am joined by Dr. Eddie Waldrep, and I am really excited to have the opportunity to have this conversation with you. We spoke briefly in Denver what was that, November? Time is flying. So it was not that long ago, about a month ago. But I didn't really get a chance to really dig into your position and understand where you're coming from in this field and what your concerns are around therapy, gender, what's this been like for you. And so I'm glad to have the opportunity to speak with you at length. And maybe you could start off by telling a little bit about your background and what brings you to the conversation.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure meeting you up in Golden, Denver kind of area for GenSpec. So for me, I've been a clinical psychologist now since about 2015, probably when I graduated. Before that, I was kind of born and raised in West Phoenix, so it's kind of where I kind of hail from. Did construction for a little while, and I joined the military. After I got out of the military, is when I got interested in basically in PTSD. So I was really interested in kind of trying to help people recover, my fellow brothers and sisters in arms, recover from PTSD. So I got really lucky kind of going to school, met some great people. Decided to go into clinical psychology. Did my studies initially where I first got out of the military here out of Fort Carson here in Colorado. I attended the University of Colorado here in Colorado Springs, and then went off to Kent State for my PhD. So most of my area of interest has been mostly PTSD for a lot of years. And then what got me kind of interested in a little bit more what's going on these days is just seeing a major shift that I think that's happened in our field that's very concerning. It seems like there's been a huge ideological shift going in ways that I think are we'll probably talk more about the ideology kind of thing. But I started to see it come out more and more. I think I was a little unaware of it happening because I've been so focused on PTSD for so long that when I started seeing it in other areas, I was a little surprised by it. Mm-hmm. I do have just a quick statement, just an official statement. I work for the Department of Veteran Affairs on the PTSD clinical team, but I just want to make clear that my statements here today are my own opinion, and they don't reflect any official positions of the Department of Veterans Affairs or any other institutions. I also don't have any financial interests or other conflicts of interest, anything like that. So I just kind of get that coming clearly and kind of out of the way. Mm-hmm. I've been kind of speaking out a little bit about these things for a little while now. And I haven't had a whole lot of positive reception. And so very similar to yours, I started seeing some of your experience. It's very similar, I think, what's been kind of going on. I've been trying to advocate for things like viewpoint diversity, how that relates to therapy. I think I was really lucky coming through at a time before the ideology set in. So a lot of the kind of the old guard, I think, of psychology, people like Jack Graham, people like that from the MMPI kind of lab, were kind of like mentors and educators. And so I think had me kind of very rooted in trying to think about things very scientifically. And so when the ideological shift kind of came in, that was a huge concern.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. You refer to it as an ideological shift, and that's my perception of it as well. And yet it's interesting when you go back and you talk to people who've been perceiving this coming for a long time, they can point to different, different points along the timeline when they're saying, no, this has been here for a long time. These kind of thoughts have been creeping in. But I did really feel like we took a leap. There was a shift. And I feel like it happened sometime between 2010 and 2020. But mm-hmm. What was your perspective on that? When do you feel like you started to really notice something was different? And what was the process like? Did it start was there a creep, or was it just suddenly you were aware that there were concepts that had become untouchable or rigid?
Yeah. No, I think creep is a good word. I've been reading some recent work by Dr. Haslam. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name right. I think he's out of Australia. We talked about concept creep, but a little bit more in the field of trauma. I think it has been going on for a long time. Like I said, I think it was just out of my awareness because I've been so specific in PTSD for a long time. That's where I spent most of my, my research and reading and literature reviews, all that kind of stuff for a long time. And as I started kind of looking into this more, I did see there's a longer record of it. I think it was kind of an insidious onset, might be a way to think about it. It's kind of, it was there and it's creeping around in different areas. And then I think in 2020 is when it really kind of blew up. And when I started reading more about these, like see where it started to seem like it set in around 2010, according to like Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff, people have been talking about this for a little while. And I think the first time I saw it really is when I was doing my postdoc in Hawaii. So I did my postdoc, out there. And so first time I was introduced to microaggressions.
Okay. What year would that have been?
Right around 2016,
Okay.
17,
Okay.
somewhere like that. I think it's 2017, somewhere right in that range. So basically, it was one of those where I had a journal club. We all read and discuss an article, and it was an article about microaggressions. I think it was a Sue article.
Yeah, Daryl Wing Sue.
Yeah,
or David Sue.
And when I first read it, I was like, well, this doesn't make a lot of sense. There's issues that kind of came out with it was kind of glaring at me, which I think is a testament, I think, to the training I had at Kent State, where I thought a lot about kind of making sure that, because in the field of psychology, we don't have standard things we can measure, right? A lot of things are psychological constructs, so we have to be very careful about how to ensure that we're not saying something exists just because we say it exists, or what they call like reification fallacy, right? So we were trained to be very kind of careful about those things. And so when I read it, I was like, well, this doesn't make any sense. It doesn't have face validity because the way it's defined, and a lot of the other kind of problems that came along with it. And then it was a couple months later when my colleagues kind of reached out and said, hey, here's this article that said all the things that you're saying, basically, by Scott Lilienfeld. It was like 2017, that's why. I guess it had just come out. Of course, he did it much more thoroughly, much more in depth, but and so I just kind of dismissed it. I was like, oh, that's good. I mean, microaggressions, they exist. I know they do. I'm happy to be interracially married. Have been since 2004. My daughter just turned 16. I mean, we've seen, some of these kinds of things in our own experience. But the way it was defined and the way it was kind of laid out, that's where like the construct validity had problems in terms of the science kind of concept. So I was like, oh, that's fine. People are gonna, sure address this. People are talking about it now, and be interesting. But then I didn't think much more about it until about 2020. After George Floyd and COVID kind of set in and sparked more conversation. And I mentioned something where I was like, yeah, this concept of microaggressions, it still has some issues with, basically, since you can't have unintentional aggression, right? It's logically inconsistent.
I think something that you're highlighting is I think it's really important. It's that there's a foundation here of substance. There are issues. There are I think I take exception with the word microaggression also, because I think it's you can't have, it's like you said, you can't have something that's aggressive and unintentional, that because the word aggression it contains within its definition intention. Right. So there's a problem with that concept, but there are ways that people have experienced I guess systemic, or whatever you want to call it. I'm stumbling over words right now because there's so many words that have become loaded with the critical theory, but there are racial differences, and there are differences in the way that you experience life due to the way that you're perceived based on group identity, or so there's a real substantial foundation. But this critical theory, the way that it comes in and tries to solve for that, feels really wrong. And have you been able to work to articulate exactly what's wrong with that?
Yeah, I'm not sure how good I'm dealing with that, but I'm trying to articulate that in some way, because I think what it does is it's almost like a antisocial kind of framework, right? It's almost like a psychopathy in some sense, because what it does is it manipulates people's desire to kind of be good, right? So people don't want people to be discriminated against. People don't want people to be kind of harmed. People want others to be treated fairly and have opportunities to flourish. And so what it does, it takes that kernel of truth that there are these things that do exist, and kind of manipulates that to turn it into its own kind of radical kind of theory. And yeah, it kind of boils things down to just that kind of Marxist orientation of everything's oppressed or oppressed. So it's like a false binary. It leaves out nuance. It leaves out kind of anything other than power dynamics. And I think that's the way it kind of gets its way in. It kind of appeals to something very natural to people. I think people are generally good, and that's something that appeals in that way.
It's almost like a distortion of compassion into indignation. It's like we're going to take your compassion and we're going to turn it into anger.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one of the things where I think about it in terms of that's what I mean by that kind of psychopathy kind of thing, right? Because it's one of the things that you don't do is if someone does have psychopathic tendencies, or for example, you don't teach them about things like empathy, because they would take those things and use it to manipulate and cause more harm. And that's what this kind of ideology seems to do. It seems to take that. And then by the time people realize that they've gone down that hole, they might have gone so far that now it's hard to kind of work your way back out of it. And that's what I've been trying to figure out now, is kind of how to have a good off-ramp for people. Because I think good people have been sucked into the ideology. They're not the ideologues. Those people do exist. Once you really want to transform society in radical ways, kind of thing, and kind of ignore the history of this ideology and how bad it is. But I think most people are generally good people. And unfortunately, it might start to ruin relationships or friendships. And that can start to create its own cognitive dissonance of like, I can't be the bad person. I'm trying to care about others,
Yeah. And I like the idea of an off-ramp and offering a way to reintegrate, really, because this is such a black and white ideology. And one of the things that's really been concerning to me is that it causes there's a backlash that's caused by it. When you are hearing over and over, for instance, that white people are bad and you're a white person, you can end up being defensive and angry and kind of seeing other racial groups as the problem. And it just foments this kind of angry, cyclical response that increases division among those who are ideologically possessed with the social justice indoctrination, and among those who are responding and reacting to that. So it seems like it's just roiling up this social tension.
Yeah, definitely. And that's where I'm trying to think about how to engage in the conversation with people in ways that it tries to minimize that, because I think that the more that's what they want. I mean, if you read the philosophy a whole lot, you kind of really get into the weeds of it. They really do think a bloody revolution is kind of necessary to bring about this utopian change. And we see it fails time and time again. But the more that happens, the more that people, the ideology itself is focused on bitterness and cynicism. That's how it creates kind of division and fosters that kind of the rivalry between the two groups, whatever they are. And intersectionality just kind of goes between any other iteration. So it just finds ways to sneak it anywhere. So I'm trying to think about how to be able to engage in ways where people don't fall susceptible to that, because the more people on the right or the left get pulled into that, because it tends to be the way it's kind of worked out. The more people start to feel like they have to be defensive, that just fuels the ideology. That's what they're wanting in the first place. And so I'm thinking that the way to hopefully overcome it is to try to focus on things like universal humanity. We say, well, we might have some disagreements, but we both agree that we want things to be better for people as we move forward. And that might be a way to kind of hopefully stave off, some of the bitterness and division that comes, because I see the more that happens, it seems like the radical ideology is winning, and I have concerns about it.
Yeah, it seems to me like there's that the process itself is contagious. There's a social contagion in that process, and when you said it's based on bitterness and cynicism, or it encourages those, maybe that's the thing, that bitterness and cynicism, when directed at another, tend to encourage that in response. And so it's not so much that the content is contagious, it's the process.
Yeah, exactly. And so people might get dug more on one side or the other. that just fuels the ideology. That's what
Mhm.
it's trying to accomplish.
Mhm.
Uh, and yeah, of course, I'm a combat vet, stuff like that. So I'm a big patriot for America, and I think that there's some of those American values that I think actually can help overcome. But
Mhm.
they've been the ideologues have been working to try to undermine those kind of values for a long time.
Mhm.
Things like kind of individual liberty, right?
Mhm.
Life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness,
Mhm.
things like that, because
Mhm.
those are individual focused. And so they've been trying to undermine, I think, those for a long time. And unfortunately, I think they've been more successful than I would like.
Mhm.
And I think had a lot of people unsuspecting, myself being one of them.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, you said that you started to see this creep into the PTSD field even.
Mhm.
And how did it manifest there? Was it just a focus on victimhood, or what was that like?
Yeah, some of the victimhood, and some of it's from our general conversations. So a lot of it started to come in really from the race-based traumas where I
Mm.
started to get more of it.
Mhm.
I started learning more about the ideology after the last election, when people started talking about critical race theory, quite a
Mhm.
bit. That's why I first started to kind of learn more about it, because I've been, I've been pretty, I guess, skeptical of media for a long time, anyways. It
Mhm.
was one of the best things from my undergraduate class I had, where we kind of challenged those kind of things. So I heard some media talking about critical race theory one way, and some media talking about critical race theory another
Mhm.
way.
Mhm.
And so I was like, well, I'm not buying what I'm hearing. So I just went into the source materials and kind
Mhm.
of
Mhm.
and then I started seeing it come into the field of PTSD, where they're starting to say that microaggressions
Mhm.
are considered to be trauma in some way,
Mhm.
which is because trauma is a very defined event. You
Mhm.
know,
Mhm.
something like sexual assault, severe motor vehicle accidents,
Mhm.
combat, things like that. And so there's no cumulative effect. Right? There's
Mhm.
no such thing as you had a whole bunch of things that are very stressful, and those all add up to being trauma. So it didn't seem to fit, but people weren't seeming to challenge that very much. Like it
Mhm.
was like people were just kind of going along for the ride with it.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
interesting. And there's been the concept of CPTSD has really become more prevalent. And so this idea that a bunch of an accumulation of smaller, like sub trauma events that are really difficult for a person can sort of create the same kind of complex in a person.
yeah, and that's been kind of going on for a while. There's different ways that they came out, because that existed for a long time. So there's people, I think Chris Bruin, if I'm wrong, don't maybe for Chris, or others have been talking about trying to remove criterion A from PTSD. So you can go back into the literature and see people having those discussions for a long time. But it was less about kind of accumulation of kind of things, and more about just looking at kind of symptom presentation,
Okay.
how those things looked.
Mm-hmm.
And so then that shift started being like you're kind of describing, where it seemed to be like more of an accumulation kind of thing. And for me,
Mm-hmm.
that's started to reinforce more of a victimhood mentality,
Mm-hmm.
um, of looking for ways to kind of catch yourself as being victimized in some way, no matter how slight,
Mm-hmm.
and or for a reason to have a diagnosis, almost seeking as it, which is very opposite to the way I've been trained. I'm a big advocate for Albert Bandura's social cognitive theory,
Mm-hmm.
because I think a lot about self-efficacy and how that relates to PTSD and recovery. I did like my dissertation looking at resiliency.
Mm-hmm.
So the way I kind of approach things is, we're not a result of our experiences. We have our experiences, but we're the
Mm-hmm.
ones that be able to define how we recover and how we move forward.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and it seemed like there's a shift, in that, trying to almost inculcate,
Mm-hmm.
victim mentality. And I've had concerns about that. I first started seeing it kind of along the lines of along race, but you see it in other ways too. Different forms of microaggressions, not using proper pronouns, and we
Mm-hmm.
see the effects of this. I mean, I'm sure that you've seen the videos of
Mm-hmm.
young people that have been, I think, kind of brought into this ideology, and they have complete meltdowns if someone uses the wrong pronoun.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just the opposite of the way I think about how we flourish as people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, but I'm much more resiliency kind of oriented, I think,
Mm-hmm.
than what the ideology wants.
And is there a way to bring that resilience focus into the larger cultural conversation? And how do you do that?
Yeah, well, I think I just saw there's a great researcher named George Bonano. He does a lot of resilience research. I just saw another video of him. So I think there's enough of a literature base out there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think trying to bring it back in, I'm not sure how to do that. I've tried to raise criticisms and concerns about the ideology. And I'm trying to think about the most effective way. I don't have the answer, to try to renew that sense. If we look at people and in terms of like the racial arena and social justice along the traditional ways that we think about those things, civil rights. You can see people like Booker T. Washington. See people like Martin Luther King and others who really strove to be able to move forward and say, regardless of those things, we have the power within us, to be able to flourish. We're not dependent on other people to give us. You just get out of our way and we can move forward, on our own, kind of thing. Some of those voices I've been very concerned that I don't see them elevated. There's another great individual, Robert Woodson, who's been a vocal civil rights leader. But it's like, if you don't buy into the ideology, it doesn't matter if you're white, if you're black or gay or straight or anything else, if you don't buy into the ideology, you get castigated and set aside as some kind of bigot. Like Dave Chappelle be called a white supremacist, things like that. It does have to make a lot of sense. It's just the way to attack anyone who doesn't toe the line to the ideology. I'm hoping that some of the recent events might be a good gateway, because in Congress are the presidents, I think, of UPenn, Harvard, they came under a lot of scrutiny for basically failing to condemn, I guess, anti-Semitism and some of the behaviors. And I think that's one of those things that hopefully is going to shock the conscience of more people, who aren't in academia, who don't see, how much this is kind of taken over. So hopefully that's going to be something that people say, yeah, I think that's, I think there's something rotten in the state of Denmark. And maybe I don't want to send my kids to college. Maybe I'm concerned about what's happening in their schools now.
Yeah, with a person who's being encouraged to take accountability and take responsibility for the direction of their life. There's a fine line between helping to build resiliency and making someone feel like their actual suffering is being dismissed. And so it seems like some of those voices you're talking about have been treated as if they are dismissing the concerns of people who are really upset about things that they feel have hurt them deeply. And so I know it's a delicate tightrope to walk, encouraging someone to build resiliency versus, dismissing their concerns. And so how do you walk that tightrope in a cultural conversation, or with an individual for that matter? How would you kind of walk through that? What's that process like, helping a person build resiliency?
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great question. And I think about it in different ways, in different contexts. Of course, it looks different in therapy than it does in more of a general, open kind of conversation. In the therapeutic context, a lot of times we take a look at, for example, in cognitive processing therapy or other cognitive behavioral therapies, we recognize that sometimes the way we perceive things influences both our emotions and our behaviors, right? And sometimes the way we perceive things can be influenced by our experiences in the past, particularly trauma in the case of the work that I do mostly. And so what we do is try to examine those things very closely. So what exactly has the influence been? What's this look like? What does this show up in my life, right? And how do how does the evidence bear on that? Move that forward. And that's usually where we're kind of looking at in terms of therapy, of how to develop a sense of resiliency. And a lot of times looking at people's own experiences, a lot of times people are much more resilient than they give themselves credit for. So sometimes just helping people kind of recognize that evidence within themselves, kind of empowering that process. And more of the more general, broad kind of conversation. There's people that have been doing that work, and I'm still wondering about how to do it, help improve that. But recognize that there's false narratives out there. Right? So the idea that because you're a Black male that you're going to be, killed by police, right? For example, right? There's great work with people like Wilfred Riley, people like this who've been working in this area for quite a while, highlighting the actual data and the statistics. I've been working on a little bit of those things myself, looking at that data. Even the idea that the race-based trauma is a thing that comes to you if you're a minority. They don't like to use the word minority anymore. They want to use other things. But I see those things as more ideological driven, right? But if you're Black, for example, the idea is that living in a world that's kind of full of white supremacy, that you're under constant threats and things like this. But if you actually go and look at the data and the evidence, Bureau of Justice Statistics and things like that, they actually do a pretty good job at those things. And they also do something called the National Crime Survey. I think that's what it's called, where they take a look at those things and say, okay, well, this is what the numbers say here, but what do people actually say who've actually experienced crimes and stuff like that? Because they just kind of grabbing, people that are not white, throw them in prison for whatever reason. And they kind of take a look at those things and they actually match up pretty well, And so there's a lot of the good data that's out there. But the idea is that people are afraid to talk about those things. Because if you try to look at facts and figures that don't fit the narrative, they're going to label you as a bigot or some kind of, and you'll be treated like a pariah. And we've seen that happen plenty of times. That's not just, it's not an unrealistic concern for people to have. But people that have been helping, I think, for me to be more confident talking about it. One is because I can see how bad that this can go. If you look at the history of socialism or communism in other countries, it's terrible what happens. And we know that it's facts. We have pictures and videos but people like John McWhorter and Glenn Lowry, they have a conversations quite a bit. And they kind of, one of the episodes I'd seen, they said, people are going to call you a racist, but you just have to know that it's not true and continue to speak out about what you think is important. And that really kind of resonated with me. So then I thought about the times that if I don't speak up, it would almost feel like there's some cowardice within, and that doesn't sit well with me. Maybe it's because I'm a combat vet. So I'm like, I've had worse than people say bad things about me in the past.
Yeah. Well, I think that's really an important thing to stress, that you're not allowing reputational threats that are not based on truth to keep you from saying what you think is true. And it's, gosh, we've seen so many people, so many professionals. I was just speaking with Elliot Kamenetsky last week. I put up a video with him this week, and he was talking about the silence of people in his field, in your field, in the field of psychology, who of any trained professionals you would think would see this coming a mile away and know what they're looking at and be able to label these processes that we're watching unfold socially and individually, and be able to say this is not right and here's what's happening. And yet the silence is deafening. And you've seen the schools be taken over by this. I was being taught by people who were preaching this stuff out of one side of their mouth while talking about, more classical psychological principles out of the other. And they were not bothering to try to bridge the gap and explain the inconsistencies in the stuff that they were teaching. And so it's really amazing the way that people have chosen to self-censor around issues that they're. And when you say cowardice, is it self-doubt? Is it because they wonder if maybe this is true, or is it just fear that if they don't go along, they're going to lose their license? Or what do you think that is based on?
Yeah. I think there's a good mix of those things there. And I met Elliot at GenSpec, and fantastic guy. So I really appreciated meeting him. But there's been people that do have those real fears about it. So, for example, with the gender affirming care, there's concerns that people had that if I don't affirm someone's gender identity, that I'll lose my license. And that was contrary to the way that I was trained. So I was lucky, I guess I came through. I learned at GenSpec that I've probably been trained in some of the earlier models of it before the Change 8, that kind of. So I was trained, I guess, more classically along those lines. And so then people had a fear. I know for me, I wasn't working with a lot of people who were, gender dysphoria, during that time frame, but I was considering myself kind of lucky. Like, wow, I'm not sure what I would do,
Mhm.
because we know that the evidence didn't support it, and it never
Mhm.
has.
Mhm.
One of the things I point people to is go look at DSM-3,
Mhm.
DSM-4, DSM-4, text revision, DSM-5. There's no evidence to say that people that have gender dysphoria are inherently transgender.
Mhm.
And most people, they tend to grow out of it,
Mhm.
so to speak, over time, or desist,
Mhm.
uh, turn out just to be mostly gay.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
there's nothing wrong with that. But we know that these things, it's not, there wasn't a lot of mystery, but people just weren't speaking up.
Mhm.
And then I think that was kind of related to harm that we've seen in kids,
Mhm.
where people being put on life altering hormones and things like this. And so for some people, I think having the fear of losing their license and their livelihood, that's very real.
Mhm.
And for me, I've been kind of vocal.
Mhm.
Um, and so as a result of it, and much like I think yourself, when people know that you speak up, they'll reach out to you and say,
Mhm.
"Hey, I appreciate hearing you say something. I've been thinking the same thing. I'm afraid to say it, out in public." I've had many of those conversations with people, and I wouldn't want to dismiss that or say that that's cowardice, because that's we have to be able to provide for our families,
Mhm. Mhm.
live our lives, things like that. Um, so I think for some people, that's what's going on.
Mhm.
Real concern, because it has happened to people, right?
Mhm.
Yourself being a good example of what happens when you kind of speak up, and
Mhm.
the
Yeah.
impact that can have, right?
Yeah.
Um, and for some people, they're just not sure if they're kind of, maybe they haven't gotten enough into the details of it,
Mhm.
right? So some people might just not feel like I don't have enough expertise in that. So I'm not going to kind of put myself out there in a way that's going to, potentially put me at jeopardy, but I'm not sure enough about it. I'm
Mhm.
more focused on providing care here or there, and I have
Mhm.
no concerns with those things as well. For me, it felt like it just because I knew that there's something else that I'm pretty confident about, and if I wasn't speaking up, that's where it started to kind of creep in with me.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, and for like my military background, I was an infantry squad leader,
Mhm.
in combat. So a lot of time in the infantry, and the mindset is kind of a little bit more of a warrior mindset. So I think that's why that kind of creeped up with me. It's like, I just can't let that happen.
Mhm. Yeah, it's like
And
that part of you was stronger than the part of you that was worried about consequences.
yeah, and I've had plenty of the consequences. I've
Yeah.
had plenty of those as well. Um, but also my wife, she's been very supportive.
Mhm.
Um, she's active duty military.
Mhm.
So we've talked about these kinds of things, and she thinks that basically my heart is in the right place. I'm doing
Mhm.
my due diligence when I criticize things. I've researched it and I've read through these things, so I'm not talking out of my
Mhm.
yeah,
Having a
yeah.
supportive partner that you can talk about these things with and that can help you to clarify your thoughts. I'm sure that's been wonderful.
Oh yeah. She doesn't like to hear a lot about it, because she's like, yeah, it's like, yeah, it's crazy, but
Ah,
that's not where I want to spend my time.
yeah.
But I think knowing that I'm thinking that I'm doing the right thing,
Yeah.
that really helps out a lot.
That's
Mhm.
good. You know,
Yeah.
something you've mentioned is the sense that you kind of got your training before a lot of this really set in. And I've been wondering a lot about that. That's been a huge part of my life the last couple of years, is being dismayed and just and really frustrated with the state of education and the
Mhm.
state of counselor education, for one thing. This is, where I've been personally, but just the sense that we went off the rails teaching professionals. And when I think about the people that I was going to school with and the way that they seem to uh in enjoy, embrace, and kind of elevate and amplify this stuff through their own engagement with the theories, the ideological stuff, a lot of the times the strongest proponents of the CRT model or the gender models would have been the students who were putting this out in their writings, and then the teacher would be using that as a model to then applaud that kind of thinking. So this was coming from the teachers, but it's also coming from the students. And you saw these emerging professionals who were so excited to go out and be activists. And you think about what a difference that frame is. It just, and I hadn't trained to be a counselor prior to that, but I'd been in counseling, and I did a undergraduate in psychology back in the late 2000s. And so I'd been around it enough to say, this is not right. This is not the way therapists are supposed to think. We're not supposed to be charged up with activist ideology in order to be social change agents and use our clients as the vehicle to change society. That seems antithetical to what therapists are supposed to be doing. And so we have this period of time right now where this is how professionals are being trained. And what does that mean? It just seems like it's sort of a I don't know, a spike in the timeline. If you think about psychological professionals, here we have this like giant glaring clump of, what is this? We've taken it. Do we go somewhere else? Do we have to retreat from this and create an alternative profession? Or is there a way to plow forward and sort of rehabilitate what's happening? I just, this is a huge question to me.
Yeah. And I don't know. There's people that say that it's just lost and that it's too far gone to be able to recover from. I think that might be true, but I also think that it's happened so relatively soon that there's still some ways to kind of, obviously, because, being a psychologist or working in the field of mental health, you believe people can change. Otherwise, we wouldn't be in this field generally. So I think there's an opportunity for us to be able to kind of recover those things. How
do you recover the reputation of a field?
Well, I think you do that with integrity.
Okay.
Right. And I think that's the first thing, because when people see that if people get a sense that you're being coy, if you're not being honest, you're not being straightforward, right? If you're not being genuine, they're not going to listen to you, right? So I think as a field, I think the first thing has to happen is take accountability and say, we think that there are some things that kind of crept in that were probably well-intentioned, but we're kind of missing the mark in important ways. And so we're kind of taking some corrective actions as a field to recover those things. And we can see where those things kind of come in. There's different multicultural models that kind of come up over time. And you can see the change when it went from kind of multicultural considerations of how people's different experiences can influence who they are as individuals, and we might take account of those things, to shift to making multicultural assumptions. So we can kind of point to those things in the record, be able to say, okay, here's where I think we started to miss the mark. So I think that's the way for the field to recover, is trying to be open, being humble, because that's some of the things we try to encourage in our clinical work. And so I think for us to have any credibility, I think that would be important. There are people trying to make some changes, like the Society for the Open Inquiry and Behavioral Sciences, some and others are doing great work. I'm not sure about how we recover enough of these things. We start pointing out where the ideology is and say, okay, here's where intersectionality comes into play. Here's what we think is the benefit of that, and here's where we think it crossed the line. This is how we walk it back. I think if we do those things, there's an opportunity to recover it. Otherwise, I think the free market will do it over time, because this has happened in the past with feminist theory. So there's a whole branch of psychotherapy that's rooted in feminism back, I think, in the 60s and the 70s. Right. And so it's the same kind of thing. It's the same kind of Marxist, basically, I think, orientation, the problems of patriarchy and like that. And so people go in for therapy and like, what your problem is the patriarchy, and you should get a sign and go protest. And like, I think I just have test anxiety. I actually think I just want to have a better relationship with my friends or my civic others. And so people stop going to that kind of therapy. I think the same thing will happen with our field. If it doesn't recover, people don't want to go and be told that you're bad because you're white, or that you're a victim because you're born X, Y, or Z, or because of your sexual orientation. I think people naturally want to find a way to flourish. And I think people get tired of being told that they're a victim. But that'll take longer, I think, for that to have a bigger effect.
Well, and I think that with all these these different movements, it seems like there's an attempt to define some kind of moral norms and pin therapy to that. And so that does seem like it's a problem for the field. If we aren't based on something, then what are you helping people to find? And so in terms of like sexual norms, we've got right now this older, I guess, an older generation of thinkers, like I would put us in that category, who would say, it is okay to be gay and lesbian, and we support your right to, XYZ with sexuality and find your partner. But then we balk at some of the newer ways that people are thinking about sexuality in terms of gender and transgenderism and the trans child, et cetera. So how do you define that? Where do you put a pin in what norms are socially healthy and what you support and what you work from when you're working with clients?
Yeah, I know. It's another great question. Um, well, I think the way I try to think about those things, I come from the old-fashioned biopsychosocial kind of model, right? So acknowledging there are things like biological reality, we have social influences, and how our psychology, those things interact. And so some things that we kind of know. So, for example, the thing that really kind of led to us being to where we're at with gay rights, for example, was recognizing that people are kind of born that way. And we kind of know this now, and we can see those things, coming from kind of biological kind of origins and things like that. But I think where the line comes in is when, I guess recently I've been thinking about in terms of elitist thought, right? When someone says, well, no, that's not good enough for us because we decided that it should be a different way, right? So they're trying to superimpose their thoughts, how things are supposed to be on top of reality. And I think that's where we try to make that distinction as best we can. Yeah, because that's part of the Marxist kind of ideology in the first place is social, social man. Basically, if you change enough of the kind of society, then men will change as a result of it. Men mean humans. Of course, that's ridiculous. We're we're evolved species. We're not, at the end of the day, we still have all the same biology that we had 100, 200,000 years ago. So changing our words on top of something is not going to change our underlying biology. I don't just mean that in terms of gender. I just mean, how our systems function and everything else. We can't say that we'll have a better lung system and our lung systems all of a sudden start to change because we talk differently. And I think that's where we try to harken back to kind of reality. I saw there's a great short clip recently by Stephen Hicks. He's a philosopher, and he talked about the question between reality and if there's a such thing as like a genuine truth. I'm probably butchering it, but one of the ways he kind of described it was that basically that truth is a relational concept between kind of how things exist in reality and the way we think about those things and how well they correspond is what objective truth is. And the more we try to impose our ideas on top of the real world, I think there's glaring kind of problems, and we see that every time they've tried it. So I think the best way for us to do that is be compassionate with people, recognizing where they're at and what they're dealing with, but then recognizing where someone's trying to have some outside idea that's trying to be superimposed on reality. In other contexts, it would be considered delusional. In a lot of ways. There's one king of England. If I said I'm the king of England, I try to superimpose that reality, it's not going to change it. But somehow it gets into this kind of ideology, and you're not supposed to question it, and that's where I have a problem.
Well, that's and with transgenderism, it's easy to, or gender ideology, it's easy to draw a bright line there. But what about some of the other ways that, and I don't know if this is something that you've really spent a lot of time with, but some of the other things that I found to be strange about the way I was taught when I was in graduate school were around human sexuality in general. So there's kind of a no holds barred, everything. The way that the field is going is like, don't kink shame, everything is okay. We can be, the polyamory is just as good as a monogamy. And so there's this real backlash against what they're calling cis heteronormativity. And
Right.
this was coming from my textbook that I was being taught in my graduate applied psychology course, that we shouldn't be cis heteronormative. You want to be supportive of all this range of human expressive behavior when it comes to sexuality. And you, as a therapist, there's no way to help steer somebody into, I don't know, contemplating what might be healthy for them, or how do you, what's your backdrop anymore? If we're not a Christian culture per se anymore, we're not a religious culture. So does something else come in to take the place of religion? And how do we establish how to help people find a healthy balance for themselves with regard to sexuality in today's climate?
Yeah, well, I think first I'll try to take it back to kind of more evolutionary kind of origins.
Mm-hmm.
We take a look at kind of human behavior and how people kind of evolved. Having kind of generally committed relationships is the way we've probably existed before there were things like religion.
Mm-hmm.
So again, we take it 300 years, 300,000 years ago. Having pair bonds is probably what drove our species. We see this in a lot of other species as well, right? So it's not saying that humans are somehow unique. That's where I think some of the ideology tries to kind of come in. They almost say, humans are separate from the rest of the animal kingdom, and we're uniquely able to generate social kind of norms that redefine our world around us. Sorry, my family just got back, so if you hear them in the background, I got the door closed. But so when I think about what's kind of natural in terms of kind of sexuality, right?
Mm-hmm.
All of us are here because sperm and egg met, right? So that's the only way you get new people, right? And so to say that that's what's been most common throughout history is just self-evident, I think. And now there's also, we see in nature too, we also see homosexuality, and we also see maybe bisexuality might be a way to think about it, right? But animals who are mate with female as well as males with their male, or things like this. So we can say that those things exist in nature, and there's no reason to think that humans being different than that. And so that's where we see kind of the lesbian, gay, bisexual. I think that's where a lot of those superimposed, be it from religion or other kind of things, saying that you can't do those things because it goes against our ideas or our beliefs. It didn't match up with reality. And I think that's why reality won out over time. But the same thing happens with some of the kink kind of stuff. What consenting adults do in their own time, right? That's the thing, that we don't shame, because people are free to do what you want. That's that's a life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, right? But the key there being the consenting adults and not trying to impose those things on others, right? And that's where I think the idea that psychologists are supposed to be activists now and start to say, well, no, if you think about things just in terms of heterosexual, or cis heteronormative, these things are they're almost funny after a while, right? But if you think about things that it's natural to be kind of males and females together, that's somehow wrong. It's not wrong. It's just, I think, natural. But it doesn't mean that you have to therefore kind of shame people who have, different kink or things that they like or that they're into, right? But you don't have to try to impose either one on others. And I think it's when you start to impose whatever side you're coming from on others is where you start to take away from the individual liberties. So I'm not sure about how to change the textbooks, and luckily I wasn't going through like I never saw a textbook that said cis heteronormative. So like I said, I came through before those things had changed. I'm not sure what I would have been like in school if that had come across, because I'd be like, ew.
It was really strange. It was very strange. Strange atmosphere to be educated in, and it was online, so it was even more, I felt a little disconnected from it, and I just felt like I was puzzling over in my corner, wondering about all these positive responses to this and not sure how to even enter in a questioning view. It was really strange.
Right. Well, a lot of the younger people are the ones who really kind of get sucked into these things quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
But we've seen that with like China's cultural revolution, right? The
Mm-hmm.
Red Guard, people like that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, maybe there's some ways because their brains aren't fully developed until around age 25.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe kind of having something they can latch on to, like, oh, this is the way we're going to change the world. It's going to be
Mm-hmm.
great, right? We're going to make things better for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe there's not enough of that skepticism that's kind of creeping in. And
Well, yeah, it does seem like this offers young people a lot of things that they really need, and it gives them inclusion, a quest, something to strive for, something, it's kind of all there. So I can see how it would be really appealing to have one of these. I guess the social justice field is anything from an environmental, climate, LGBT, BLM, all these different things give somebody a sense of anchoring into something larger than themselves, and that transcendent belonging, which
Mhm.
is really tempting. I can see why it's so alluring.
Oh yeah, and we see those things. Those things are just natural for young people, right?
Mm-hmm.
Skateboard culture, culture
Yeah.
to back in my day, kind of get earrings and kind of punk rock
Yeah.
kind of stuff, all that kind of stuff. It's natural for young people to have something that they get excited about, they get kind of fueled with, and that's where this ideology has really kind of crept in, and I think it's been going on for quite a while.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember who it was, but I watched a discussion by an individual who talked about basically this has been going on through our education departments for a long time. And
Mm-hmm.
that's why there's a lot of, I think, older people like myself. Someday you'll get there. uh, but who we were taught, I think, more old fashioned ways, right? How to be independent thinkers,
Mm-hmm.
right? You're challenged a lot. Yeah, teachers didn't coddle us, right? The
Mm-hmm.
keep it simple, stupid was one of those things that we were told a lot, as kids. And
Mm-hmm.
they'd probably get you thrown out of school if a teacher said that to a student these days.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but they've been basically working their way through. So a lot of the radicals in the 60s, they never really left the universities. And so they went through their school, they got their PhDs and stuff like that, and went into these different fields, such as the field of education. And then they've been branching out apparently into different areas to start teaching the younger teachers. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's how this has kind of come up. Where when I was going to school in the 80s and 90s, there was probably some few small people in different areas. But as this started to creep more through the departments of education and started to come more to the teachers, that's how our young people, I think, started to be the ones that are driving this. So it used to be,
Mm-hmm.
I guess, like faculty members who would say, "Oh, this is terrible. We got to change the system," right? And
Mm-hmm.
all those things. And then all of a sudden, it's shifted to where now people are saying it's the kids that are doing it more, like you were
Mm-hmm.
describing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's because it's kind of been percolating up, through K through 12,
Mm-hmm.
social emotional learning they call it now.
Mm-hmm.
Belonging, inclusivity,
Yeah.
stuff like this, which are things that we want, but I think we want the traditional meanings of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like you said about shifting language, and now
Mhm.
you're using words to kind of disguise the meaning of things.
Exactly, it's very Orwellian. It's
Mm-hmm.
like you read Orwell, it kind of comes right up. Actually, we got someone try to hem me up on that of kind of pointing out the similarity between this and Orwell.
Mm.
Silly kind of times that we live in. But so my daughter, of course, when she's coming up through these things, so we talk about these things. I try to I could try to inoculate her, so to speak,
Mm-hmm.
against the
And
ideology.
you said is she a teenager?
Yeah, teenager.
Are you
Yeah.
thinking of sending her to college?
Um, yeah, yes and no. Because I have concerns about the colleges, and
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to pay, $80,000, $100,000 for people to try to brainwash her because I don't have a lot of confidence that you actually get an education these days,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Um, you know, you can learn about Marxism and these kinds of things. It took me about 10 minutes to figure out what it was.
Mm-hmm.
When I first kind of came across these, like, oh, it's critical theory. It comes from
Mm-hmm.
the school of Frankfurt. Like, okay, well, I know what this is now.
Yeah.
It doesn't take time. It's not very sophisticated, and that's why they tell you you're not supposed to question those things.
Yeah.
You
Because
start
it
questioning
falls
these things,
apart quickly,
yeah,
unravels.
you start to see right through it.
Mm-hmm.
And so and there's some areas of professional life moving forward where you might have the credentials to move in
Mm-hmm.
different fields.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where I'm kind of wondering about if it's worthwhile to go to college or not.
Mhm.
But she's thinking about maybe going to one of the military schools or something like that. So maybe wouldn't be as bad there as it might be at other places. But I mean, I never thought I would, fathom there'd be a day when I'm like, I don't want my kid to go to Harvard. I
Yeah,
don't want my kid to go
yeah,
to Stanford. I don't
I
want my kid
know.
to go to,
Yeah.
I never thought that would ever exist in my mind. I never thought I would ever consider like, well, maybe a conservative school would be better.
Mhm.
Not that I consider myself necessarily conservative, more like classical liberal, but
Mhm.
I'm thinking like there, they might not be trying to indoctrinate her.
Right. Right.
I never thought I'd be thinking that framework.
Yeah, it is a really difficult time right now. And this for the same reason that we were talking about with the psychology profession having
Mhm.
this, there's this blip in the timeline. It's like this for colleges too. We still want our kids and we still want ourselves to gain the credentials that we need in order to work in the fields that we've been imagining ourselves going into. But now, what are we facing when we enter one of these programs? We are
Right.
many times facing, I don't think that it's easy to get, either you're going to be indoctrinated into this or you're going to struggle through your cognitive dissonance and have, and either way it's psychologically harmful to go through one of these critical training programs.
Yeah, definitely, because there's also the opportunity cost as well. So
Mhm.
even if you can't go through these things, and you're like, oh, I'm not buying into the mindset.
Yeah,
I'm challenging these things. I'm going to stick with my principles. I'm going to have the
yeah.
courage to stand up and tell the professors like, no,
Mhm.
white people are not bad,
Yeah.
and these kinds of things. But that also means it comes at the expense of what you could have been spending that time doing otherwise, right? Because you could have spent that time kind of, looking at different philosophers. What were their
Mhm.
agreements? What were their
Mhm.
disagreements? How'd they come across? What are your thoughts about it, right?
Mhm.
How are you challenging these things yourself? Where's your skeptical analysis? I hate to use critical now because critical
Right.
is
It means
so,
something.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. But how are you developing your own sense of healthy skepticism, right?
Mhm.
How are you trying to ensure that it's not fueling your own ego, that you think that you're so smart because you came, you're agreeing with something like, how
Mhm.
do you back yourself off your own high horse?
Mhm.
um, I think those are the things that are missing, you know, and and that's where I'm not sure if I want to spend all that money because I want to be able to have the
Mhm.
credentials. It's gonna be her own choice, of course, when what she wants to do.
Mhm. Mhm.
But it's a lot of money to spend.
Yeah.
Uh, to come out, I had $190,000 in student loans when I got done, all said and done, and I would hate to be paying that to be brainwashed,
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah.
you know, and because I think some of our younger therapists, to be effective, I think they're going to have to unlearn what they were
Oh
taught. And
gosh, so much. And
yeah,
I, speaking of the money, when you brought that up, it reminded me of at one point, my worst class in graduate school was this multicultural perspectives course that I've talked quite a bit about it. It was like a DEI course, and
mm-hmm,
it really stood out as being different than my other counselor training
mm-hmm,
materials that I was being taught because it was so sophomoric in some ways, and so just it very starkly was this CRT kind of teaching.
right,
And I spent the semester kind of writing back and forth to the professor in these long, what she called journals. And we had to kind of write our process with the material.
mm-hmm,
And it was a lot of me trying to delicately challenge this stuff because I wanted to be open to what I was learning and I wanted to process it as intellectually as I could. And so we're reading Daryl Wing Sue, for instance, and I'm trying to challenge some of the things that he's saying while still giving credit to some of the foundations that are underneath of it. And she would just write back that basically it was my white privilege that was making me interpret things this way or that. And at one point I said, I feel like I calculated how much I had spent on this course, and it was something like, I don't know, $2,600 for this one course. It's crazy
mm-hmm,
expensive.
yeah,
And I said something about that. And she said, the fact that you can look at a course like this so transactionally is a mark of your societal privilege or something like that. And I'm like,
right,
no, it's a mark of the fact that I'm not working right now so that I can take this course. And my
mm-hmm,
family is taking a massive hit. so
Right.
that I can pay for this class, and I want it to actually be something of value. So
Mhm.
it's really, yeah, that you are, I mean, there's a lot of cost, like you said, opportunity costs, there's what you're not doing,
Right.
and
And
there's
those
finances.
and those things are so contrary to what we actually do in terms of psychology, right? So I
Mhm.
mean, that's you're basically describing the cognitive distortion of oversimplification,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Everything in the world can be oversimplified to your white privilege or whatever, right? I mean, it's
Yeah.
and this is something that we work with our clients,
Mhm.
in therapy to recognize because that's a pathological way of thinking.
Mhm.
I had the same thing with a training we had gone through where one of our postdocs was doing a presentation on microaggressions, and he used an example. There's a white couple and a black man gets on the elevator, and the white woman gets closer to her husband, right? And
Mhm.
you're supposed to be cued to say, well, this is some kind of microaggression, right?
Mhm.
Um, but that's mind reading.
Yeah.
You don't you don't know what this person was thinking.
You're right.
Yeah, and that's another pathological. Like you can open up any cognitive behavioral therapy textbook. You can Google cognitive distortions, and you'll see
Mhm.
both of those. You'll probably
Mhm.
see oversimplifying and mind reading or jumping to conclusions. These are
Mhm.
pathological ways of thinking,
Mhm.
and and this is being inculcated by our educators.
Mhm.
It's like what are we doing here, and how am I wrong
Yeah. That
for raising?
reminds me of when this is one of the few examples that stood out to me even back when I was in undergrad. So I did my undergrad, I graduated in 2008
Mhm.
from St. Mary's University in San Antonio, Texas. And it was
Okay.
a pretty good program, the
Mhm.
clinical psychology program there. And there was one example in a textbook that talked about unconscious bias and
Mhm.
racism, and they showed two pictures that were used in a study to assess unconscious bias, and they were claiming that the results showed bias against blacks, but they
Uh-huh.
were two young men, and the white kid, the white man, is dressed pretty nicely, and he's standing upright. I think maybe he had his hands in his pockets, but he's just standing with an open body posture. And
Uh-huh.
then they had a black kid the same age, and he's wearing like a sports outfit, maybe like a hoodie or something, but he's crouched down in kind of next to a car tire with his body turned away, and you can't see one of his hands, and it's night. And I thought, there are so many different variables in these two photos. This is not a fair thing to
Right.
present people with. You got one guy who's hiding his body and the other guy who's presenting himself, and different, everything about them, they're so different. I thought, how is that okay to use these as examples? You could really swap the races, and you'd probably get the same response from people feeling more
Yeah.
suspicion from the one guy than the other.
Yeah. 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 And that's an excellent observation. That's one of the things that's kind of been influencing so many of these things. I'd seen similar kind of things. And because I graduated also my undergrad in 2008. So that's when I kind of
Okay.
completed undergrad back then. And and since then, there's been so much more of the research on implicit bias. I mean, now we could, pretty fairly say that, there's no evidence that supports implicit bias,
Yeah.
right? It's kind of,
Hmm.
in more lay terms, it's probably junk science at this
Yeah.
point, right? And there's a whole host of different things. There's Lee Jesselman has a great Psychology Today article. It has like a whole archive, so
Hmm.
people go through and read all the articles that they want to along those lines. Um, but there's a article I think also actually by Jesselman. I think it's published in 2020, Ideological Bias in Social Science, I think it was.
Hmm.
And they highlight, I think it was that article, where those kind of inflammatory or big results, they'll get a whole lot of citations that get put into textbooks. And then later on, research will actually come along and say, actually, if you kind of run this
Hmm.
a different way, you actually get a different result, or these other factors that weren't taken into account. And those get hardly any citations, and they don't make it into the textbooks.
Hmm.
So they have things that are actually refuted and refuted very well.
Hmm.
All people will see be the one that was sensational,
Hmm.
in textbooks and things like that, and that kind of
Hmm.
skews the perspective over
Hmm.
time.
So the
Uh,
damage is done, even if they,
exactly.
yeah. Hmm.
Yeah,
Hmm.
exactly. Even there's the one too about was a stereotype threat,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
So like, oh yeah, there's a stereotype threat if you're a minority or if you're a woman. you're not as good as math or whatever kind of stuff.
Mhm.
And it's a stereotype threat that accounted for these differences. But what actually had happened was just a statistical thing.
Mm.
So they basically, it was a analysis of covariance, right? So for the stats nerds out there, I used to teach stats and stuff like that. But basically, if you control for prior variance, then there's no variance in the outcome. That's what
Mhm.
analysis of covariance is.
Mhm.
And that's all that it was. It was the use of ANCOVA, so that the differences that were observed initially
Mhm.
were not observed in the outcome.
Mhm.
That's because it was controlled for. That's just the way the statistics work.
Mhm.
And so people had this a whole lot of time talking about stereotype threat when it never existed.
Mhm.
In even the initial analyses was just they had misquoted their own results.
Mhm.
Uh, or misquoted, or it wasn't explained thoroughly enough
Mhm.
about how that's a result of using that type of analysis.
Mhm.
But people don't hear about those things.
Mhm.
You're not going to find that in the textbooks, and it's really unfortunate.
Yeah, I'm mindful of the time, but also so tempted to just launch into a bunch of questions about behavioral sciences and how this field sort of makes up so much and tries so hard to bolster its own credibility and doesn't
Mhm.
admit doesn't I feel like there's a lack of humility
Oh,
within the social sciences because there's so much variation, there's so much we don't know, and the individuality is you can't parse it in terms of intersectionality. It's
mhm.
I'm tempted to just pick your brain about that, but I should
Yeah.
probably, if you have any thoughts, I'd love to hear.
Well, yeah. Well, and I know we want to be mindful of the time, but yeah, I've been thinking about that recently as well, because there's been a long time that our field has uh,
Mhm.
dealt with the insecurity of not being a real science, right? That's
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
this kind of thing, right?
Hmm.
And a lot of medical doctors and physical scientists like whatever, psychology kind of thing, right? And so I've been really remiss that more of our students haven't read Paul Neal. I'm not sure if you've ever read any of his.
No. What's Paul Neal?
Paul
N-E,
Neal,
how do you spell his
Meehl. Um,
Meehl?
so
Okay.
it's like famous for a lot, like Meehl and Krombach is people that kind of back in the 50s. I think it's Meehl and Krombach 1955 is
Okay.
one of the things that people use for how to look at construct validity, for example. He has a great article, I think it was like 1976, but some of the things he pointed out was the problem that, in our field of psychology, since we don't have those solid things we can measure, right?
Hmm.
Like in physics, they have like, this is 1 meter and it's like a metal bar that's
Hmm.
measured 1 meter, and you can go compare against those kinds of things. And so really kind of digging into those things about how well we can actually develop our fields in ways that we're mindful of the limitations we have. And I think as a way to be have humility and try to do the precision as best we can, knowing that we have limitations. And it seems like that has just been lost on what I've
Hmm.
been seeing in the field in the last few
Hmm.
years. And so I'm hopeful that people will be able to kind of retrace our origins, where we kind of came from in the first place.
Hmm.
Like, yeah, it's true. We don't have as much solid footing as physical sciences, right? If an
Hmm.
engineer wants to send a rocket to space, right, they have to do all the calculations and they send it to space and see what happens. They can measure the
Hmm.
results that way.
Hmm.
We can't. And it seems like it's been unfortunate that one of the biggest impacts that our field has had has been to push this pernicious ideology onto others.
Hmm.
You know, yeah, there's
Yeah.
probably an old Greek myth that probably describes this process well, but it's unfortunate because it's like now's our chance. Now we can be worth something. Now we can actually have an impact.
Yeah.
What are you doing with it? You're creating bitterness and cynicism and trying to tear down our society. You know.
Yeah. And I think you described it really well as an insecurity around not being a real science. And I guess something that occurs to me is that at the end of the day, if it is to be a real science, that's going to turn everybody into ones and zeros, and you're going to have this perfect technocratic understanding of people that breaks us down as if we are robots to some extent. And is that even a desirable thing, or is there some way to separate from the separate what is scienceable, what is knowable in some kind of testable and reproducible way, from an appreciation of the spiritual nature of humans, that there's something ethereal that we can't understand in that way, that can't be measured. And is that a desirable thing? And maybe we don't have to be a science.
Yeah. I think there's ways to kind of have kind of both of those things. I think having a decent amount of humility, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's things that we can kind of understand about these things, but obviously we have the replication crisis, which I think is a good thing for our field to be able to correct some of the hubris that has kind of gone on.
I'm sorry,
Uh,
what the which crisis? I missed that word.
the replication crisis.
Replication crisis. Okay.
Yeah. Basically, when they try to replicate these studies and they didn't turn out like,
Yeah.
oh, this is something we know in psychology, and they try to reproduce the experiment and it doesn't work out.
Mm-hmm.
And like, oh, maybe not. And so I think that was good for us in terms of being able to kind of correct where people were overstepping where the science can actually take us.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the ability to kind of have awe and inspiration and the pursuit of beauty and love, those are also aspects of human behavior. And so that might be something we can't kind of, drill our way down to the zeros and the ones. But we can appreciate that and try to understand as best we can, even if we can't go completely reductionist. Hopefully.
And are you optimistic about where we are, or what do you think? What gives you optimism, if any?
Yeah, well, what gives me optimism is the human capacity to change, right? And I think we've had great things to look back on our history. I mean, we've gone through, slavery, oppression. We've gone through wars, famines, throughout human history. We tend to think about this last little snapshot of 500 years and represents all of humanity, and it's just not true. And I think through those things, kind of, truth and compassion for others has gotten us to where we are today. And I think we still have that capacity. And I think people are trying to undermine it. And I don't think it's going to work out well. I think there's only so long that looking at, like, for example, Mao's China, when they went through Mao Zedong and had the Cultural Revolution, right? So they imposed the communist ideology, this false binary. They kind of imposed all these kind of things, but people were miserable. People, I think I've seen estimates up to 60 million people might have died. I mean, it's absolutely atrocious. And over time, they said it didn't work well, so they opened them back up to more of individual liberty and kind of free market kind of environment, and it started to boom back and it started to flourish. And now Xi Jinping is over there, and he's trying to take it back to some more stricter, communist kind of ideology. And I think it's going to start to shrink again. So I think over time, people will say, like, this is just a failed ideology. You can impose this on people, you get people to buy into it, but it turns out terribly every time. And so my optimism is hoping that truth will win. And I'm hopeful that we do it before it goes too far here in America, because I don't want my daughter or your kids or other people in society to go the way it's gone every time that they've tried this somewhere else. So that's my optimism, is hoping that truth wins.
Well, I love that. It's been a really great conversation, Eddie. I've really enjoyed speaking with you. Thanks for ranging all over the place with me in this conversation. Where can people find you online if they want to follow you and your work?
Yeah, well, I am on X now, formerly Twitter. So I went on there finally. I have a Substack I haven't started writing yet, but I have like the name for it. Salty Grunt Doc. But I haven't started writing a whole lot there yet. Mainly because there's been some other things going through work. I make sure I have the Office of Governmental Compliance kind of things. Make sure I'm doing things properly, things along those lines. But hopefully in the future I'll have a website, and I might have a book maybe getting started. Hopefully, more along the lines of race-based trauma and stress.
Well, I hope you do work on that. I think your ideas are a great contribution. And what is your X handle, if anybody's just listening?
Dr. Eddie Waldrep. So it's pretty straightforward.
Great.
I'm hoping to maybe I'm thinking about starting an LLC this this next year after we get through the holidays, because I've been thinking about actually of trying to offer some kind of consultation services. I think the future, if we do recover, I think there's going to be a lot of mental health professionals that are going to have to kind of unlearn, like we talked about, the radical ideology, and how to go back to like just considering unconditional positive regard. How do I actually work with the person across from me in a meaningful way without having this kind of mindset of looking at them through these different lenses and this intersectional framework that most people are getting taught these days. So I'm thinking about trying to start those things though. So I might have a website to come, and when I do, I'll put that on the Twitter handle thing.
Excellent. Well, if you want to send me any links, I can include those in the description. So I'll have your Substack and any other links that you want to offer. And thank you again. It's been really great talking with you.
Yeah, great conversation. Thank you much.
All right.